And let me welcome our panel. It's a great pleasure to now go a little bit more deeply into the TTC issues, the Trade and Technology Council issues, and where we currently stand on trade and tech issues. And for this, I'm really happy that we have Mr. TTC with us, Rupert Schlegelmilch, just coming right out of Brussels, and you are on your way to
Mexico.
Mexico. That's what I said. You are at the same time. That's what I call multitasking, negotiating with Mexico while being here at our Aspen, Germany Trade and Tech Conference. Thank you so much for joining us. And this is also one of the reasons why we have to end on time, because Rupert needs to catch his flight to Mexico. Otherwise, we would be in trouble, without one of our chief negotiators. I'm also really happy that Tobias Lindner, Minister of State at the Federal Foreign Office, has joined us. You are also really busy this week because of the Munich Security Conference, but not just that, but because there's so much going on also with regard to assisting, helping Ukraine, weapon deliveries, financial support, the discussions of the new future peace order for Europe, the transatlantic partnership, and so many more issues you have to deal with in the background on the way to the MSC and after. And also joining us digitally or virtually, which I'm really happy that you were able to join us, is David Weiner. He is Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Europe at the USTR, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And you are, I would say, the U.S. Mr. TTC on the other side of the, of the Atlantic. And let me start with a very brief question. If you were to tell somebody who has never heard about the TTC, how would you explain the TTC very, very shortly and very persuasively, Rupert?
Well, thank you, Stormy. I would, for the non-initiated, the non-trade nerds, I would say the TTC is an attempt to live up to what Angela just told us, that technology, digital, and trade are no longer living in silos. So if you want to have an effective trade policy, you have to know what your tech people are doing, be it facilitating trade, making sure that trade does not get in the way, that trade barriers don't get in the way. And you also have to see that tech and security will impact trade, because it's all very well to talk about trade facilitation and more trade. And by the way, the EU-US trade is doing very well. I want to say that up front. Despite all the issues you might hear, it's doing very well. But you also have to be sure that you know what's happened on the security side, because on the security side, there are export controls, there is investment screening and things like that. So the TTC is an attempt to have a full conversation with the United States, between the United States and Europe, to address these issues in a holistic way.
David, the TTC in 3 words or 5.
maybe a few more than 5. And I should clarify. First of all, thank you for letting me join you virtually. And I regret that neither I nor colleagues from USTR could join you in person here today. I know that would be much easier in terms of having a constructive conversation. But so thank you for letting us do this remotely. And I'm pleased also to be joined on this panel by Rupert Schlegelmilch, who's a longtime colleague of ours and friend of ours from the European Commission, and good to meet Dr. Lindner as well. I really couldn't modify anything that Rupert said about the TTC and what it is. I would add just that I agree entirely with his characterization of it. I would probably add just a couple of other more practical things, which is that from the perspective of the Biden administration, the TTC is really now the mechanism through which we are driving our cooperation on a wide range of issues. All of them touch on trade and technology, of course. That's obvious from the title of the initiative, but I think it's important to understand that the TTC has become the mechanism through which we are seeking to collaborate on a wide range of an extraordinarily wide range of issues. And I think a key premise of the TTC, this is really my opinion, it's not stated anywhere in US government documents about the initiative, but I think a key premise of the TTC with which I think Rupert and Dr. Lindner would agree, is that there's an extraordinary alignment in U.S. Values and U.S. and EU values and perspectives on how to manage our economies, how the global system should be managed, and we're seeking and that alignment in our values gives us an opportunity to collaborate more closely than we already do on a range of these this extremely wide range of technology and trade issues.
Thank you so much. And Tobias, what is that thing to you, that animal?
So my quick answer would be, Europe and the US, they are sharing the same challenges. Rupert named a few of those, be it the climate crisis, be it critical rare materials, the resilience of supply chains, and so on and so forth. And I think that the main purpose of the TTC is not to give the same answers at every point to at least similar challenges, but to have the same framework and the same preconditions and the same level playing field, so that this competition and this collaboration meeting those challenges does lead to a race to the top and not to a race to the bottom, and not to a case where protectionism is back.
Mm. No, thank you so much. Rupert, you just said, despite what everybody is saying, the TTC is doing really well. What makes you say, despite what everybody is saying, it's doing really well? I mean, you seem to be a little bit in the defensive, no?
No, I mean, there have been questions on deliverables because everybody wants tangible outcomes. You want a regulation to be changed or aligned on both sides of the Atlantic. And that's what our trade people look for. Or you want to have full congruence on digital single market act from the United States, COSECTIV, etc. I think that's why sometimes we also have to explain all of this starts with very complex discussions, and we have a lot of very, very deep discussions on artificial intelligence. You just don't regulate like this and align rules, risk assessments, etc. on both sides of the Atlantic. So part of the output is not that visible, and this is what we sometimes have to explain. The other point that I mentioned is, of course, we still have our differences. And one of them was the elephant in the room at the last TTC meeting. Not the elephant in the room, actually we talked a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act and how to turn our cooperation in the Trade and Tech Council into helping the green transition along, trying also to look at some of the things we don't like there, but making it a positive forum to look at the green transition, to work on climate change. And for those who don't know the details, we work on carbon measurement in work group 2, electric vehicle standard in working group 1, all the issues which are relevant for investment and export controls, which are linked to these issues. There are many issues which are linked to the question of the green transition or having a more effective investment in climate, which are discussed. And we need to harness that in order to also work on our differences.
Mm. Tobias, the elephant in the room, what bugged us about that elephant so much, the Inflation Reduction Act? Why weren't we celebrating that the United States has finally passed a huge climate and energy bill?
Yeah, about this elephant, the issue is not at which goal the elephant is moving, but it's about the way how he is moving. So meaning that, I'm a green politician and I clearly appreciate the goals of the IRA, having a green transition of the industry, boosting electric vehicles, for instance, really fighting the climate crisis. These are really goals that I appreciate and that I share. At the same time, we have to take into account that the way how the IRA is designed is a threat to transatlantic trade relations, for sure. I think there is no reason why the European Union should be treated worse in comparison to Canada or, for instance, to Mexico. So, long story short, we have to stay in touch with our American friends and partners about the implementation of the IRA and how the European Union is treated in regard to, especially to Canada and to Mexico.
Thank you so much. Before I hand over to David, is that something which the Commission shares, what Tobias has just said?
Well, we have made clear that we have certain issues with the IRA because of the unprecedented amount of subsidies, which lead to obviously drawing investment away from Europe, could lead, and the discrimination. The world trading system is based on non-discrimination. But we also have to be pragmatic. We now have to see what to do. This law will not be changed overnight, that's for sure. So we're now trying to see what we can do because we want to cooperate. On these big themes like the green transition, we need to cooperate, and we will cooperate. We have to just make sure that we don't get into each other's hairs too much when we do so.
David, what do you think when you hear this on one side praise for the act, but on the other side also there's a little bit more critical view? And tell us also a little bit about how the TTC or this newly created committee on the IRA is trying to solve that problem.
Well, of course, the praise for the IRA is appreciated on our side. The recognition that the IRA makes a number of very important departures for the United States, historic action on climate, and we appreciate that has been recognized and noted by a number of senior officials on the EU side. And I think, but at the same time, I think we do understand some of the concerns that have been raised by our EU friends. The White House took those concerns very seriously and established pretty quickly a significant task force to which you just alluded, which is addressing the EU's concerns on the IRA. Rupert is one of the main people involved in that task force and engaging with that task force on the EU side, and I can tell you all that he's doing a very good job of bringing to us concerns at a very technical level. And I think, and I hope Rupert would agree, I think there's been good engagement through this task force in addressing the concerns that have been raised. You saw, or many people in the audience will be aware that at the end of 2022, just in the last week of the year, the Treasury Department issued some new guidance on how it will be implementing the IRA. The Treasury Department has the lead for the implementation of the IRA in the U.S. government, not my agency, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, although we're actively involved in the task force discussions. The Treasury clarified some of the provisions that relate to the eligibility for tax credits for electric vehicles, which will expand, we think, the scope of vehicles or the scope of exporters exporters to the United States of vehicles the vehicles that will be subject or eligible for the consumer tax credit. Treasury also indicated that it is looking at some additional provisions in the IRA and hopes to have some clarifications on how those will be implemented in March. So I think that those clarifications and the work that we've been doing with the EU and the task force reflect a really good faith effort by the administration to try to address where possible, consistent with the words of the legislation, EU concerns.
One thing which we learned throughout the COVID pandemic, but also painfully after Russia attacked Ukraine, is that on one hand side, trade is really important for growth, for jobs, for innovation, for our well-being, but it can also become a vulnerability if we are too dependent on individual suppliers, but also on individual buyers and markets. And so on both sides of the Atlantic, we are trying to reduce vulnerabilities by de-risking or decoupling, but by also producing more at home and bringing back some production to our own market. And so there's a lot of talk about smart industrial policy. And that's something I would like to briefly discuss with you. What smart industrial policy could be is supporting production at home while also preventing a subsidy race and hurting each other. Just a few days ago, I heard that supporting big semiconductor companies is like a big a big money transfer from the general public to those companies. And sometimes money is also burned, but you have to do it to stay ahead in the tech competition. And so, Tobias, easy question. What would be a smart industrial policy strategy without hurting international trade?
So first of all, we are in a situation where we are missing a comprehensive trade agreement from the European Union with the US. We can talk, I think, the whole evening about what happened to TTIP and all those things, but we have to accept that's the status quo, and it would take a long time, and honestly too long if you see the current challenges until such an agreement one day is set up and ratified. But there is a risk, and at the same time there is a chance that we establish when we are talking about electric vehicles, for instance, batteries, smart technologies, AI, that we are coming to the same standards, or at least to standards which are mutual acceptable in the end. So that would be the first step. Avoid protectionist measures, try to have common standards, try to make trade on those solutions easier. Second, we need to share information about the assessment of our own companies, which are really critical supply chains. Where is resilience of our supply chains in danger? What are key technologies where we should be able to at least produce some things or some shares of that at home? And last but not least, I think that's the most important point also regarding the development of our own China strategy as German government, is it's not about a decoupling, but it's about the identification of critical one-sided dependencies, and at the same time about diversification. Every good company on this planet, every large company diversifies its supply chains and has maybe 2 or 3 suppliers for the same critical pre-bought product or part in its product. We have to do the same as economies, as common markets, and share information and our strategies on that.
Thank you so much. David, if I may hand over to you.
Well, I'll have to clarify that I don't have any real expertise on industrial policy. It's not what I focus on at our agency, but I think I would certainly accept the premise of your question, Stormy. The idea that the observation that there is a lot of discussion about new industrial policies in this era. I don't know whether as a factual matter the United States government refers to some of the things that we've been doing in relation to chips or in the infrastructure legislation or in the IRA as industrial policy, but you certainly see a desire in the United States to look at ways to make our supply chains more resilient, more diverse. And at USTR, there's a very significant, at our agency, at USTR, there's a very significant focus on seeing how we can use trade policy to support those goals, to support the increased resilience of supply chains, to support, of course, the ability of U.S. manufacturing to make the transition, make both a digital and a clean and a green transition. We're very much focused at USTR in seeing how we can use trade policies to support those goals, and I think we see the TTC as a potentially valuable tool in that regard. In addition to the Export Controls Working Group, which was already mentioned, and the Trade Challenges Working Group, on which we at USTR spend a significant amount of time. There's also a working group in the TTC on supply chains. They've talked about semiconductors in that working group and cooperating on transparency and semiconductor support, because of course the EU is also has its own CHIPS Act, and it's an area where we potentially could coordinate to avoid the subsidies race that you mentioned, Stormy. So I would just say I can't really comment on the pros and cons of industrial policy in any detail, but I can tell you that looking for ways to make our trade policy and the US-EU trade relationship a tool for making our US and EU supply chains and industries more safe and secure and diversified is a goal of the United States.
Same for the EU?
Yeah, I would even go one step further than David and say it not only supports, a smart industrial policy includes trade policy as one of the tools. Because you can be as smart as you want if you don't have access to the raw materials, and if you don't have components from where you need them, you will never be self-sufficient and just do it on your own. That's not the reality of economics, and also I think that's not something desirable. So you have to factor in the contribution of trade to make sure that the de-risking that we all, and the diversification is basically having, and this is actually what also the Commission is saying in its response on the Green Deal, Industrial Green Deal, trade policy is one of the pillars of this industrial policy, which makes sure that what we want to do internally happens, because you need the external dimension. So absolutely part of the strategy, and that means getting on with smart liberalization if you want. It's not necessarily tariffs with the United States, but it's certainly the regulatory discussions on supply chain management, the third country, what can we do to secure sources against the competition in the world in third countries and so on. All of that is part of that new smart trade policy, smart industrial policy.
Mm. And Tobias, and everything has to do also with security and a changing geopolitical environment in which we are living. And there's the elephant IRA, but there's a much bigger one, right? Which is over in Asia, China. And it seems like that all the discussions we are having also, looking from the outside to the TTC, it seems to be also a lot about China and how we deal with China in technology and trade, with regard to values and so on. Is that right, Tobias?
I think that's right. You know, I'm sitting very relaxed here because the German government is now 14 months or something in office. But let me make clear, we are coming from a time at which, for many years, especially from a German perspective, it seemed that especially with regard to China, that you can separate your economic relations, your economic ties from the other political issues. And honestly, that's not true. We have learned our lessons from Russia, how our critical one-sided dependencies, be it on gas, coal or oil, how critical they are. That means we need to learn our lessons with regard to China, with regard to critical one-sided dependencies. And if you mention the TTC, that's one reason why the German government is drafting a China strategy. We are doing that for our industry, for our companies, to clarify, okay, in which fields is competition possible, in which issues is even partnership, be it fighting the climate crisis, possible. But we are also drafting this strategy not only for our domestic economy, but also for our partners and allies in the European Union, but also in the United States, to clarify, okay, what's our position? Where do we have common goals? Where do we have identical positions? Where can we develop similar strategies how to deal with? And last but not least, we are also drafting it, honestly, for the government in Beijing, because we need to also to clarify what defines a systemic rivalry with the People's Republic of China, at which issues are we at different sides and have different opinions and ideas how this world should evolve, and which are the fields under this umbrella of the systemic rivalry in which partnership and cooperation is still possible.
Oh, Tobias, you just gave me a, whatever that is in English, Steilvorlage.
Sorry about that.
No, for a follow-up question. Drafting a China strategy is probably not the easiest thing. And there was some controversy around our chancellor going to China. There were some, clear comments from your boss with regard to that trip. Could you tell us a little bit about where the China strategy is going?
We are in the drafting process, and we are in the interagency process at the moment. As you all know, we are at the final stages of our national security strategy, a strategy that's the first strategy of Germany really coping with security. We call it in a holistic, in an integrated way, dealing with security from a military perspective, as well as from an economic and a domestic, as well as from environmental perspective. And that strategy, I think it will be published during the next weeks. And after that strategy, which is a major strategic document, the China strategy as one part will follow. So you can expect it, I would say, during the middle of the year, something around that. And it will have concrete measures and concrete ideas how we are dealing with those challenges.
Well, thank you so much for the cliffhanger. We hang in there for the China strategy. Rupert, is this, or what we sometimes hear is that there is no unified European China strategy yet, and that there are differences between EU member states. Is that still correct, or is it because of the big challenges now a pretty big convergence?
Well, first of all, there is an EU-China strategy. It might be 2 or 3 years old, but it does actually take up some of the themes we hear here. We define, China can be a rival, can be a partner, and can be an adversary. So there's the trialogue, if you wish, of issues there. And of course, some issues we have to work together, and others we are seeing real differences. And this is why, by the way, the trade people have come up with this anti-coercion instrument. I'm not sure you heard about that. But it's actually something to counter some of the coercion practices where trade is weaponized. We don't want to wait to go to the WTO and find out 3 years later that we won a case. So we actually see that rivalry also in our part of the world. So I would think that overall, if you wish, the honeymoon with China is probably over for all of the European member states. The fact that we have challenges there which are not only commercial, but that we have to have a closer look at some of the consequences of the engagement. I think that's shared in the EU. And then, of course, when you then go out and find ways, what do you do about it with policy tools? When you talk about export controls, possible investment, the new theme is now, do we need outward investment controls, things like that? Then you might see different opinions depending where your interests are. But I would not talk about it Europe, which is not clear in its vision and is trying to face the new, if you wish, realities, where there's a much more assertive stance also in trade policy, using trade policy from the Chinese government.
No, thank you, Rupert, for reminding us that words matter. There is a strategy, but there might be sometimes little differences in the policies afterwards. Huh? David, the EU and also Germany has come a long way with regard to China if you compare it to 4 years ago or five years ago. Are you happy, or would you like to see even more?
Well, I think we have observed on the U.S. side an evolution in EU thinking about China and EU's EU posture on China. There's, of course, the EU has a challenge which we don't quite face in the U.S. side because of the structural differences. The EU needs to find its way to consensus on difficult issues like this when there are as many as 27 different views on how to proceed. And so I'm an admirer of the EU, and I think it's pretty extraordinary how effectively the EU is. Although we are often frustrated, we on the U.S. side are often frustrated with aspects of EU policy in various areas. I think it's important to recognize the extraordinary degree to which the EU is able to come to consensus on very difficult and challenging issues like this. And I think what we've seen in the last several years is that the United States and the EU are very, very closely aligned in terms of our assessment of the challenges posed by China, and in particular the challenges that we focus on most at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and I suppose in the European Commission Trade Directorate, are China's non-market policies and practices. Of course, China pursues some other policies which are of concern to us, and especially or even more greater concern to other parts of our respective governments. But I think we see, as I said, a pretty strong alignment in our assessment of the challenges. And increasing alignment in some of the ideas we have for responding to those challenges. We don't always agree precisely on which tools to use and when to use them, but we have seen the EU, and Rupert just mentioned one, the anti-coercion instrument. We've seen the EU developing for itself a number of tools which could be used to respond in a pretty effective way to Chinese policies and practices that concern the EU and us as well. So we're pleased by that, and I think that has made it possible for us to cooperate more closely, both within the TTC in several of the working groups on China-related concerns, but also outside of the TTC. There's a number of ways in which we engage with each other, the US and the EU, on shared concerns with China that are outside of the TTC.
Thank you so very much. Before I open up for questions, Rupert, could you just briefly explain what that anti-coercion instrument is and if it's already used?
Well, it's not yet adopted, so I think the idea is is very clear that if we see that there is an economic measure which is basically coercive, and you probably know the examples out there, and they were mainly, I have to say, used by the Chinese governments against countries like Lithuania, for example, where we took a case in the WTO, that we can actually respond with countermeasures quickly without having to go through what is normally the legal avenue to solve a conflict, which is purely a trade conflict where you have the WTO. So it's exactly the nexus, and I want to come back to the TTC from time to time. It's exactly the nexus between the security policies and the trade policy that we see developing that we want to address, and which are also part of the TTC discussion. The TTC is not an anti-China or anything tool, but if you look around you, you just need to talk about coercion. You need to talk about non-market economy practices because they influence the marketplace, and you have to deal with them in many sectors. We have seen this. So this is why this is one part of the toolbox that we are developing to be more responsive to some of these challenges. And we are very happy to work with the United States, who is a like-minded partner. Tobias said that. It's very important to never forget. When we fret about things in the United States, we have much bigger problems in the world when it comes to trade policy. Also on the question of subsidies, which of course have been going on, and we've been arguing and discussing a little bit for a long time for the need for more international rules on subsidies, because nobody was aware of this sustained effort of a state government to subsidize its economy. End of parenthesis. So that's what the anti-coercion element is about, and what the TTC is partly about as well.
No, thank you so much. I asked because not all of our audience might know what the anti-coercion instrument is. And I think it's a pretty big step forward for the EU to do something like this. So please, questions from the audience. And just as a reminder, it would be great if you then stand up and also say your name and then also look into the camera. So please, in the way back, I hardly can see you, but please. And the mic is coming. It's right over there. Very good.
Moritz Lüttgerath from Berlin Global Advisors. Thank you very much for this panel so far. I'd have two questions, if you will allow. The first one, as you will be aware, obviously there have been bilateral talks between the United States and the Netherlands to align export control measures when it comes to inputs for advanced semiconductors, which might be exported to China or might not. And I'd be curious whether, to what degree the EU has been engaged in those negotiations, or whether those were treated as a bilateral matter, and to what degree there is an effort to elevate them to the TTC level discussions as well. And secondly, following up on the Council conclusions from last week at the European Council, I'd be curious to what degree there is an effort to shift forward some of the financing plans as part of Next Generation EU to sort of meet the subsidy plans the IRA has sort of mobilized on the United States. So whether there will be a shift in emissions calendars and spending on the EU side as part of Next Gen. Thank you.
Wow, big questions. There's another question in the back, and the mic is coming. And then I come up here. No? No.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm Sarah Jackson with E3G. It's a climate change think tank, so my question is in regard to climate. I already appreciate the discussion of the IRA, but I think one of the things missing from the discussion so far around the IRA and industrial policy has been, what does an EU-US subsidy race mean for third countries? So I'd be really curious to hear from both sides of the Atlantic, what is the US-EU view on how does industrial policy impact third countries and the international impact and the clean transition globally? Thanks.
Thank you very much. And yeah, please, here in the second row.
Thank you very much. My name is Wolfgang Kleinwächter. I'm a retired professor from the University of Aarhus. We had in the previous panels the discussion on regulation. So you have a special working group on AI, and the US has drafted a framework for a bill of AI rights. The European Union is drafting its own AI package, how you use the TTC to harmonize the regulatory approach, because if you compare the two drafts, there are a lot of differences, and is the TTC a vehicle to harmonize this? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Since Rupert, you have to leave really on 10 past sharp, I want to hand back the floor to you first.
Well, I don't have all the answers. Let's be clear. But, I mean, on this first question about this very well publicized case about export controls, I have to be very careful because this is really a national security issue for one of our member states, but it affects, I can say as much, it affects the European Union because the products which are exported as part of this bigger package of machinery come from all over the EU. And we have an export control dialogue in the TTC, which works fantastically on Russia. Let's be very clear, we have done a lot of alignment. We have not seen unilateral extraterritorial action, meaning actions which affect other parts of the universe by unilateral measures. We still have some work to do on working better together on some of the other cases. That's very clear. But there is a dialogue ongoing between all concerned. That's also clear. So here, I think this is one of the things that TTC has really brought forward. We are much further than we were on this whole question of export controls. There's a lot more dialogue going on shared risk assessment and so on. But in the end, measures are still taken. Sometimes, they're taken, full stop. So I'll stop here. And I think, we're trying to, as always, make all of this more coherent. On the other question on Repower EU and whether we front load some of the financing, obviously that's under discussion. I'm not the expert on this. I have to be very, very clear. I can't really say much on that, except that we are trying at the same time be more effective internally, which is obviously the whole idea, because we also know that our system can be slow, can be bureaucratic. You have member states, local authorities, the commission, everywhere else, and it takes some time to get money rolling, money out of the door. The US system is much easier, and we have to maybe also learn a lesson once in a while on how to help our nascent industry. So I'll stop here. Then on the last question, which I still remember, was the question on artificial intelligence. We are doing something which we call the roadmap on AI, which is the main piece of the AI work under the TTC, where we are trying to the regulators talk to each other on the risk assessment which underpin all the possible policy responses. This is, I think, the most important part, which will hopefully also influence the final way that these things will work. We're not going to have similar regulation. That's just not going to happen because the systems are too different. But they should be compatible. The idea is that what we do, we are informed well enough to make sure that operators who operate in both jurisdictions can actually more or less rely on the same framework. So they don't have to completely redo their risk assessments. They know what the other side, what the expectations are, et cetera, et cetera. Then the question from 3GG, I want to answer that. I need to remember what it was. Sorry, I forgot the question. I don't have my notes.
On climate issues and industrial policy and climate and also TTC.
Sorry, I'm really sorry. What was the question? Oh, on third countries. Sorry, that was it. Yeah. Well, honestly, right now we're really trying to sort out what the impact is on our own investment climate, etc. But you can, of course, immediately say that the attraction, the pull factor, certainly into the US, where we can already calculate, and the IRS has done calculation about the benefits, and to some extent, probably maybe to a lesser extent, what we were doing, it might lead to different allocations of capital, which is, of course, not what we want, because we want to have climate policies which work everywhere in the world. So we have to see whether through the kind of help and Global Gateway is the new flagship program of the EU, whether we can also see whether there's things that need to be offset if that is really the case. I think it's a little bit too early to say, but certainly we don't want to do this at the expense of other countries. That's certainly not the intention.
Rupert, thank you so very much. I know that you do have to go. So give him a really big applause because he made a huge effort to come here today. Thank you very much. And We hope to see you soon again here in Berlin. And good flight and no delays. So we have a couple of more minutes, 5 more minutes. So I actually do want to bring up the discussion or take the discussion to climate issues and the TTC and in how far trade and climate is actually discussed in the transatlantic relationship. Tobias, climate issues obviously are a hugely important thing for your party, but also for you personally, and also important in foreign policy and economic issues. And we also have a little bit of a problem with this mic, but I hope it holds up. So okay, oh, I don't want to create any back. Okay, yeah, wonderful, thank you. This is quick problem solving. Do you think trade and climate issues need to be more closely connected?
For sure, I'm totally convinced they are interconnected. Therefore, we have to find common strategies. If you draw the big picture, we are in a situation where governments as players in economies are back, where they play a much bigger role, be it AI, be it fighting the climate crisis, be it security issues related to semiconductors, for instance. And I believe the challenge is to define our trade relations and to do it in a way that it's not, as I said in the beginning, a race to the bottom in sense of both sides are giving subsidies, establishing different standards, and so on and so forth. The good news is we as Europeans, it's not only my own party, we as Europeans who are convinced that protecting the climate and doing adaptation to the global warming is essential also for our future as industrial countries and for our economies. We now have a US government that almost have the same position, that sees the same challenge. So let's try to shift gears, especially concerning the TTC, and come to common standards, or at least to standards that are compatible, and where you can really, as a German investor or as an American investor on the other market, do your business.
And David, climate and trade related?
Oh, certainly. I mean, just at a very practical level, the practice of trade is itself sometimes the movement of ships and aircraft around the world carrying goods is itself a climate, potentially has implications, of course, for the climate. But we see the Biden administration, I think is just highly mobilized on climate issues, more so perhaps than any of its predecessors. And we are seeking to address it in a variety of ways. And the administration views trade policy as a very critical tool in that regard. In the TTC, we have a working group on trade and on climate and clean technology, which is looking at these issues in particular. The TTC co-chairs in December agreed to launch a transatlantic initiative on sustainable trade. It was initially a commission proposal embraced by the United States, and we're in the early stages of planning that. But the hope is that we can pull together strands of work that relate to the climate and the sustainability of our manufacturing and our service economies, and pull those threads together from different parts of the TTC and create perhaps a more coherent strategy for addressing climate issues using trade policy as a tool in that respect.
No, thank you. David, there are so many elephants we are talking about today, and there's another one. Do you like CBAM?
I'm probably not the right person at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative to ask that question. My understanding is that we would like to make sure that when the CBAM is fully implemented on the EU side, that there is some ability for the EU side to recognize the steps that the United States has taken to address the emissions intensity of production in the United States, even though we do not at this time tax carbon emissions as has been done in other countries around the world. So we support the goals of CBAM certainly. I don't have the expertise or the authorization to really offer an official comment on it. But I do know that we have the hope that the CBAM will be implemented in a way that accounts for the variability in ways that countries around the world are, many of them in good faith, seeking to reduce their carbon emissions.
And Tobias, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, well, I mean, your minister is flying around the world trying to form new partnerships. Do they like that idea?
So, you know, I'm an economist by training. And first of all, CBAM is a proposal how to get a price tag on carbon emissions. And I think that's important. I think that's an important goal, how to integrate carbon emissions into the price mechanism of market economies. And honestly, the global warming doesn't care if carbon emissions are emitted from the European Union, from China, or from the United States, for instance. In the end, for sure, we have to talk about details, we have to talk about the implementation, but I encourage everyone who has a better idea how to put a price tag on carbon emissions, please present that idea to me.
I think there might be someone in the audience who are going to send you some proposals. Last question, because I also got it online here. Is the TTC, I mean, enough, or do we actually want an EU-US FTA? Do you want a EU FTA, Tobias? I'm so sorry, I'm putting you on the spot
that's
several
fine,
times.
that's fine. My answer would have been, it depends. And let me be very honest. The TTC is not enough, not at the current state. As I said in the beginning, we need to shift gears. We need to speeden up. We need to address more issues in the TTC. And personally, I would be very happy if we would come to a free trade agreement with the United States. At the same time, we have to take into account that especially comprehensive agreements, the so-called mixed agreements, and let's don't point the finger on TTIP. Just take into regard that CETA is not ratified by all member states of the European Union at that point, and I do not have any estimate at which time it will be. So let's take into account comprehensive free trade agreements might be very difficult to achieve. That's not an excuse to do nothing. And if the TTC should lead at some point to some agreement that's really feasible, I would be happy to support such.
Thank you so much for these clear words. You can applaud in a second because we need to hear David as well. David, appetite for a TTIP 3.0?
I think the Biden administration's assessment is very similar to the one that Dr. Lindner just offered, which is that we know from our experience in TTIP that negotiating a comprehensive, binding international agreement is very challenging, practically and politically. And I think that our view now is that the United States and the EU would be it would be better for us to be focused more on cooperating in ways that promote our trade and investment in new and emerging technologies, and then help us respond more effectively to challenges we both face from non-market policies and practices. And we can do those things. We can cooperate better on ways to promote trade and investment in emerging technology, and in responding to non-market challenges. We can do that without pursuing a comprehensive free trade agreement. And we think that should be our focus now.
Thank you very much. And now it's the time for a big applause for our panelists. Thank you so much, David, for joining us online. And thank you so much, Tobias.
Thank you for having me.
And I wish you lots of good luck for the next week and for everything which comes up. Thank you so much.